been studying Lake Missoula and the floods for about 30 years now. Lake Missoula was a huge lake. It was about the size of a Great Lake, but it was twice as deep. So it's like two Great Lakes stacked one on top of the other. Erie and Huron stacked together just about make a Lake Missoula. It's 2,000 feet deep at the dam and about 1,000 feet deep here in Missoula. Now when the wind would blow, it would blow down the lake for a distance of 80 to 90 miles, and in so doing it would pile up waves, some pretty good sized waves. And Jumbo and Sentinel sit here at the end of that wave fetch, and the waves would break on Jumbo and Sentinel. And as you look out the window, particularly now with this little skiff of snow melting, they're very visible. You'll see horizontal lines going across the mountains. And those are the beaches of Lake Missoula, and that's how we can tell how deep it was. When the water got deep enough, it would float this ice dam, blow it out very suddenly in a matter of hours, and 2,000 feet of water would head for the Pacific Ocean.
How did this all happen?
Okay, the main players are the ice ages. About 100,000 years ago, the climate got a little colder, but as important as the climate getting colder, it started to snow a lot more. And as that snow built up and got deeper and deeper, the water built up behind the dam until it reached almost the top of the dam, and water is incompressible, so it would conduct all of the pressure at the bottom of the dam to anywhere a crack or a little rivulet could reach. And then it would act like a hydraulic piston and just jack the whole dam off of its foundation. Once that process got started, the dam would fracture and break up very suddenly, a couple of hours. When this ice dam would burst, the water would shoot this way trying to get to the ocean. Now, sometimes Lake Columbia was in, and it was backed up by an ice dam right where Grand Coulee Dam sits today. When Lake Columbia was in, then it would fill up like a bathtub, and just like a bathtub, a shallow bit of water going over the rim and all over the whole length of the rim, same deal. It would activate all of these channels at once, but not too deeply. So the water would run overland for a little ways until it started concentrating in the gullies and creeks. Then it would get deep again and make a huge, very deep, 200-300 foot deep flood. When Lake Columbia was out, most of the water would come down this channel and just try to get to the ocean as fast as it could. Now down here at Wallula Gap, the spot in Montana that determined how much water could get out how fast is Eddie Narrows down by Thompson Falls. Eddie Narrows is twice as big as Wallula Gap. So Montana is letting out water twice as fast as Washington can get rid of it. So a large temporary lake backs up in the Pasco Basin that drains off more slowly. This is the entrance to the Columbia Gorge, down by the Dalles. It's the same way. The Columbia Gorge cannot let out water as fast as Eddie Narrows is letting out water, so we get another big lake here. This keeps going on. The Narrows down here below Portland, same way, and the water backed up into the Willamette Valley. All of this gray area is the area that was carved out. It's called the Channel Scablands by that flood, and it continued on till it got to the Pacific Ocean. This water was going 60, 70 miles an hour. The first thing you would have felt is a huge windstorm. So this stuff is just roaring and ripping. Everything it touches, it's ripping to pieces in seconds. Huge waterfalls, 3-4 times wider and twice as tall as Niagara Falls, are tearing up the countryside and moving backwards. Like Niagara Falls has taken hundreds and hundreds of years to move back a couple of miles. These things were moving miles in less than a day. Now every time this happened, the mud that had been collected in the flood above that point would settle out. So all of the wonderful agricultural soils in the Quincy Pasco Basin and the Willamette Valley, and that's why it's as good a soil as it is. So we didn't really get glaciated, but we got all of the rock flour that melted out of the glaciers, and that gave us the Lake Missoula lake bottom soils, and that's the tan colored material you see on the way to the airport. It's very fine grained, it's very abrasive, and it's very sterile. It doesn't grow things very well. It's almost an insecticide for bugs because of the abrasiveness rubs holes in their shells. So it really affects what kind of bugs and where we have bugs. It also affects, grass is very competitive on fine-grained soils, and trees are very competitive on rocky soils. So basically on the Lake Missoula muds, it's grass and sagebrush and always will be because of the nature of that soil. Whereas in the places where that's been cleaned out and regular brown river silt has been put in, that is a wonderful fertile soil, and that is how we got the name Garden City. That's where the Garden City gardens grow in, and the difference can almost not be more than night and day. And likewise, as you go up the mountains, it's grass clear till you get to the height of Lake Missoula, and then you get into the native soils, which are rockier and much better drained, and trees can live. So we're kind of a flip-flop of many places in that you go up the mountains to get to the trees and the older, deeper soils. And so as you look around the valley, you could pretty well tell what was under Lake Missoula just by trees or no trees and fertile or non-fertile. It makes a big, big difference in our valley.
Were there any trees when the Salish Indians came?
Actually, before anyone was settled here, there were no trees in Missoula at all because there was no soil in there. Has anyone heard of the glacial Lake Missoula? Have you ever heard of that?
Okay.
So it was a big, huge lake in here, and a dam broke about 3 or 4 times over tens of thousands of years ago. And whenever that dam broke and it created the Columbia River Valley, it took out all of the soil from this valley. So this was an inhospitable place for trees to be living. There were only grasses and there were bitterroot flowers. That's our native flower for Montana. And so the Salish would come up every spring and they would harvest the bitterroots out of our valley. And the reason why we know there were no trees is because this entire valley was covered in beautiful purple bitterroot flowers. Do you know what an arboretum is? An arboretum is basically a living museum of trees and shrubs. And every state has a state arboretum. And the University of Montana campus here in Missoula is our state of Montana arboretum. The entire campus is. The Salish, they lived down in the Bitterroot. That's where they hung out and that's where their home really was. They came up in the spring specifically to harvest all the bitterroot flowers, but they would go back home. So when basically the European settlers came into the Missoula Valley and they created Missoula Mills and they started building all the buildings. So they started bringing trees in. And when they bring trees in, they would have to go get soil and bring soil in. Now over tens of thousands of years, we have dust bringing in soil and it settles in, but it's just not the best. It drains because we've got a lot of rock. So whenever we do plant trees here, we do have to make sure that there's plenty of soil to support that tree. The trees that we did import and the trees that are brought here to make the place livable, to make it cooler, to give us all of these wonderful benefits, to make it a more beautiful place. But in exchange, we have to take care of them and we have to make sure that we water them.
So who brought in the first trees to Missoula?
The founding fathers of Missoula brought in the trees. So C.P. Higgin and Francis Warden, they brought in the first trees and they were fruit trees for the orchards. at the lower rattlesnake area. And they also brought in the first shade trees, so they're Norway trees. They wanted to make it a beautiful city, and they knew to do so that they wanted tree-lined streets. So they brought in the first trees in 1874.
So how long can trees live in a city?
When you put a tree in between, let's say a sidewalk and a street, they don't have much space to grow. They just have a lot more stressors on them than trees that grow in the wild. They absorb all of the pollutants from our vehicles. They shade us, they take all the air pollutions, all of the ozone that's coming out of our sky that's bad for us. They're absorbing all the stuff. Plus they're not getting probably as much water as they need. The trees that are in Missoula, in the oldest districts of Missoula, they were all planted starting in 1874 and heavily planted after that. So the majority of the trees in the University District, in Slant Streets, in North Side, West Side, they were all planted in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they're reaching the end of their natural lifespan in a city. So we're going to be losing thousands of trees within the next 5 to 15 years in those areas.
Are there more like species coming into this area and like attracting new animals that are going to come into town? Or?
They may be attracting more insects that may be flying around. And there's a really bad one coming down the pipe, and it's called the emerald ash borer. And it's this really, really pretty beetle-looking bug, and it's got this gorgeous emerald green. And as soon as the emerald ash borer gets here, all of those trees are going to die. So that's one really good reason of why when you're planting an urban forest or you're planting trees, you don't want to plant just one kind of tree.
How do non-native plants disrupt the ecosystem?
The invasive plants tend to take over by utilizing the same resources that our native plants need to be able to thrive. And they tend to do it better because they have no natural controls. So they tend to be able to produce a ton of seeds and put down very deep roots. And then over time, that starts to slowly choke out our beneficial plants, and we have an unhealthy ecosystem at that point. The most common one that most every Montana person would know is spotted knapweed. It does not discriminate where it likes to grow. It likes to grow in our forest, it likes to grow in our prairie grasslands, it even will grow in your backyard. Dalmatian toadflax is what we call an escaped ornamental, meaning that it was purchased for its beauty and planted in people's yards or cutting gardens. This plant, which looks like a snapdragon, produces up to 500,000 seeds per plant. That's a lot of seeds to be dumping on the ground each year. It also has a significant root system that spreads underground, sort of like an aspen grove would, where the roots are connected all underground, sending them to new places for new shoots and plants to be. The other common one that I'd like to talk about today is leafy spurge. And coming June, if you look up on our hillsides, up on Mount Jumbo and on Sentinel and a little bit on Waterworks Hill, you'll notice a funny green, yellowy green color, and that's this leafy spurge plant. It's not that significant of a plant, it's kind of little, but it certainly packs a punch with its root system. It can put a root down about 30 feet. This plant also is capable of shooting its seed 15 feet. The seed pod, when it's ripe in the summer, pops like a popcorn and the seed shoots for 15 feet. So this is really able to move around. It floats in the river conveniently too. So this one's another one that is very common and will be around for some time in Missoula County.
How are all these weeds spreading around?
So humans definitely are moving seeds around, whether that be through planting a seed for your garden that maybe you have a seed you didn't want in there, it's going to grow that way. And seeds are adapted to be able to attach to our clothing, to fur, so animals, wildlife, pets also are moving plants around through the rivers, through the wind, through ingesting them. They're all able to move around naturally as well.
What will we have to do to get them under control again?
So if you're going to get rid of something like spotted knapweed, I think the first step is you've got to decide what to grow. The second one is which we started in Missoula in the 70s, was called biological weed control. Here's an example. I don't know whether we can pick any of this up on camera. Those are a weevil. They're called Siphoncleones. And this one feeds on the roots.
So what are some other insects that help clear out the noxious weeds?
For example, on leafy spurge, this plant, they have introduced a moth. It's a hawk moth, and it has a very large caterpillar. It's very brightly colored, and this caterpillar basically eats the foliage. So that works against the plant being able to produce carbohydrates to feed that root system. But they've also introduced some little tiny insects that are called flea beetles, and they're very small, and they feed on the root system of the leafy spurge. This plant, Dalmatian toadflax, they have released a weevil, and it feeds basically in the stem.
What kind of native plants do bees affect?
When we think of pollinizers, we certainly think of our honeybees. They also provide a food source for many of our birds, our native birds, and that we find that as a food source. So yes, the native plants and the native plant pollinizers, the native plant community insects are all very important. Yes.
We run an organization called Wild Skies Raptor Center. And our main focus is rescue, rehab, and release of injured native raptor species. But we also save some for educational use that are not releasable. As far as Missoula area and raptors, we brought these two with us because these are both species that you can see here in Missoula, or Missoula Valley anyway. The Swainson's hawk, there's quite a few nesting territories or pairs out west of town, kind of between Missoula and Frenchtown, that area. There's only a known about 14 territories of Swainson's in Missoula, between Missoula and Frenchtown. So there isn't a ton. These are grassland obligate species, so they require that type of territory or open grasslands to actually nest and breed. Little owls like this are cavity nesters, so they require old woodpecker cavities or just natural cavities in trees. So a lot of times they're not always dead trees, but that's another good reason to kind of keep some dead trees or snags around, because there's a lot of species that require those natural cavities in order to reproduce.
I read like great horned owls have been around for like 80 million years.
So, and a lot of the owls have been around the longest as far as like the avian predators and stuff. They're really good at what they do, and they've just stayed around.
A lot of the Ice Age megafauna has died off, but in Lake Missoula times we had elephants, mammoths, mastadons. Mammoths ate grass, mastodons ate pine trees and twigs. That's the difference between them. But we had both kinds of elephants, rhinoceros, llamas. So we've got all of that, all of those herbivores. We also had the predators to eat them. So we had short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, probably American hyena, certainly American cheetahs.
So what are the top 5 industries in Missoula?
That's an excellent question. So I think most of them have to do with the natural resources of the area. So we have our big river that comes through town. So the river provided power for mills. So we had forestry with sawmills, and then we also had farms. And Then there were people coming in to do some mining around the area, so the industries had to supply the miners. So we had people with stores. Let's see, what was my fifth one? Oh, and the railroad. So the railroad brought supplies and things in.
How did the railroad change Missoula?
But once there were train tracks coming into Missoula, they could bring all kinds of things from all over the country. So for people living in Missoula, they got to feel like they lived in a real, proper city.
Do you have any important information about forestry in Missoula?
Our forests are some pretty important resources for us, and we have a lot of forests in the Missoula area. We're also lucky that we have the regional office for the Forest Service here too. So for a long time, for more than a century, they've been kind of trying to manage the forests, and not just for us to enjoy, but for us to use the resources to build things. So they have a really important job to keep an eye on the forest and figure out how much is safe and sustainable to harvest and how much we need to keep everything in the forest healthy.
Has any of these industries been like harmful at all to us?
A lot of us have probably noticed that we don't have as many sawmills and lumber mills around as we used to. They polluted a lot. So there were a lot of problems with the air quality here, and a lot of times they would burn the waste from the mills, so that would make smoke. And if you're around anytime we have fires in the valley, you know that the smoke gets kind of stuck in the valley, so that was pretty bad for breathing. And they've done a lot of different projects in the last couple decades to clean up the pollution from some of these industries as well.
So why did people move to the Missoula Valley?
So we know that Native people have lived in the Missoula Valley for thousands of years, and they've come through to harvest bitterroot and other flowers, and also to travel to where the bison were. European settlers came because there were really good resources in the area.
Do you know how many people populated the Missoula Valley?
Around the year 1880, which is pretty close to when Fort Missoula was built, there were only about 300 people living in the Missoula area. But by 1920, there were 12,000 people.
So what was the time period, and how long ago did people populate the Missoula Valley?
What's pretty cool is that the Native people who lived here before Lewis and Clark got here, the Salish, they know of this place as being their ancestral homeland and a place where they have lived for many, many generations.